Wow, a lot has happened today, so I just wanted to talk about propaganda because it looks to me as though propaganda is actually happening in the here and now rather than in a a fictional book we were reading about World War II. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about specifically the idea that we have to stay closed as a country and an economy until fall. I'm seeing, for instance, locally, the director of the health department in Los Angeles County said that we wouldn't be able to reopen, or we would have to shelter in place until September. And so, hi, Jose. Good to see you. We would have to shelter in place until September. And it's strange because, like, out in the city, out in the neighborhood, people are starting to get back to normal, especially people in kind of disadvantaged areas, people who have to work, who live hand to mouth, who live paycheck to paycheck. They want to work. They are working hard. They've got, mouths to feed, babies coming. And so I haven't really checked out every area of the city, but my business is getting calls. We are operating. It's not a restaurant. It's cleaning and installation of flooring. So that's my day job, and it pays the bills. But it's very strange because I saw comments on Facebook from people, ostensibly, I would assume, who live in LA, and they were saying, "Oh, this is wonderful. Yes, stay in place, stay safe, and listen to the government. Listen to the authorities." But I don't really know very many people who feel that way. Now, we can still wear masks, and we can take precautions, and we can work and go about our business. I believe my niece is a cosmetologist. She cuts hair, and she's going back to work very soon. So I don't know how that fits in with sheltering in place, or what the announcement was today from the head of the health department in the county. Another big thing was that we had a very interesting video conference testimony before the Senate. It was so bizarre. I don't even know if that's like technically legal. I guess if the Senate's going to vote, they have to be in the Capitol, but this was a committee meeting, and so it was very funny to see Bernie Sanders like I just saw a glimpse of him like adjusting his earpiece. It just cracked me up. And then of course the witness today was Dr. Anthony Fauci, head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and much has been spoken about him now in different areas, different arenas, depending on who you ask. There have been some accusations leveled against him, even without any accusations against Dr. Fauci for supposedly delaying therapy for AIDS, and essentially delaying the isolation of the virus, HIV virus genome, and injecting people in a clinical trial with an unsafe vaccine. Those are all accusations alleged by someone who used to work for him. And even aside from that, if we just look at everything that we know, I did a timeline last week or a few days ago, and you look at what he was saying in 2017, January, right before the inauguration. He gave a talk at Georgetown University, and he said, "There's no doubt in my mind that we are going to have a surprise virus pandemic that will challenge Donald Trump." Very, very odd, because he, along with Robert Redfield, are are in charge of the infectious disease response for the country. But he didn't seem that prepared. He seemed very, we don't really know. We don't have the contagion rate and the death rate yet. Be that as it may, there are standard responses to a new virus and a pandemic that just didn't happen, and I'll tell you what they are. One, actually, one was the preventing people from flying in from China. They were the World Health Organization was advising governments to continue normal travel, and I went and looked at the literature, the studies that say that travel bans don't work to prevent pandemics, and it looks like everybody disagrees with that now. But back in January, that's what the World Health Organization was telling people. So, of course, famously, we know that Donald Trump talks about he talks all the time about establishing that. I think it was on January 30th or 31st, excuse me. And then, of course, Nancy Pelosi came back and said, well, but you didn't bar U.S. citizens from coming back from China, which that would be like tragic and awful, right? And then the New York Times put out that, oh yeah, well, that was the only thing he did right. But they never mentioned that he and Alex Azar, head of Health and Human Services, which oversees the CDC, they instituted a mandatory quarantine for 2 weeks for any American citizen, family of American citizen, or green card holder that they allowed back into the United States. Was the response perfect? No, it wasn't. For instance, they had supposedly put monitoring in place even before that travel ban from Asia in major cities. Los Angeles, New York, but not Seattle. So we've been finding out things about this later on, things that were happening. For instance, we found that the first patient in China was probably around middle of November. We're also finding out that there were a lot of cases that went undetected in the United States well before the first known case was acknowledged by the CDC. I'm not saying the CDC knew, I'm just saying that it had already entered. Now, China actually did lose us a lot of time because they did not announce the pandemic until people started traveling for the Lunar New Year, which is obviously the biggest holiday in the in Asian culture. China, Japan, Singapore, Korea, Hong Kong. And so a lot of Chinese go to Japan for festivals, which I did not know. And Taiwan as well. Taiwan was very concerned, and they sent an email to the CDC, and it was a very polite email because a news report had just come out stating that it was December 30th or 31st, stating that there were a handful of abnormal pneumonia cases in Wuhan, China, and I guess for infectious disease specialists, the key piece of info is human to human transmission. So Taiwan health minister sent an email to the World Health Organization, which technically they're not members of the World Health Organization, specifically because China does not acknowledge their existence. So they sent an email saying, we saw news reports about these cases, and it says, if you have any knowledge of this, please share it with us. Well, the WHO never answered the email. And then when they got in trouble for it, Taiwan released the email. Some of the headlines said that Taiwan warned the WHO, but in all fairness, they never specified person-to-person transmission, so each side dug in, and it was like kind of an international incident where they were arguing back and forth in the press. And be that as it may, Taiwan was not warned. Taiwan is a very interesting case. They suffered under the SARS pandemic in 2003, which by comparison makes it looks like nothing compared to this. But Taiwan really made use of their time since 2003, and they were ready. They were ready to develop a test immediately, a PCR test that actually worked. It's very complicated and it requires very expensive machinery. So, if we wanted to figure out who had it immediately, which we should have authorized and certified and trained heavily every regional hospital in the country, every city hospital in the country, and had everything ready. Who dropped the ball? Multiple people. Our system dropped the ball. Okay, these PCR tests, they are not what South Korea used, but South Korea was also prepared. They used a newly developed antigen test. They actually, when they had 4 cases, they put out a request for proposal for companies to come up with antigen tests for the new virus. And about a month later, they were ready. Now, those tests are not as accurate as the PCR tests, and they only detect cases where antibodies have appeared, which is usually after a case has been active. Even when someone is almost all recovered and maybe testing negative with a swab, the traditional PCR test, they might not show antigens for several days, but eventually they do, antibodies, which is your immune system's response to the disease. But South Korea did it so quickly that they were able to catch people who had gotten into the country early on and had already developed antigens, which, if you think about it, would have really helped us. We would have known what we were dealing with. Now, if the Centers for Disease Control and Infection is not responsible for us having a widespread PCR swab tests everywhere and personal protective equipment, and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases did not make sure that we had the latest tests as well as antigen tests to detect and see if people had already had the illness, then what are they doing? They had one job. Now, how do we detect bias against the president? Well, here's how we do it. Look at Andrew Cuomo, okay? Andrew Cuomo is only as good as people who are giving him advice. Andrew Cuomo thought we were going to need 30,000 to 40,000 ventilators in New York City, right? Turns out, even as early as January, the medical practitioners who treated the very first patient in Seattle, they noticed some characteristics of this disease that probably wouldn't call for a ventilator. It was more like altitude sickness, being oxygen starved and not realizing it. So they're just sitting there talking, but their lips are turning blue. This is where cases have turned for the worse very, very, very quickly. And this is the danger of COVID-19. But we've known this. And when the cases started hitting New York, they just kept going with what they thought they should do to respond to acute respiratory disease syndromes. I believe it's called ARDS, which is a general term for a symptom when people have acute lung diseases. So that is really a mystery. It's like, why? The information is readily available. Ventilators are often the wrong thing. And even if ventilators were the right thing, people often don't survive after that. It's like a last resort. And yet, people were being put on ventilators early. I read from many accounts, people who were volunteering in New York. They put people on ventilators quite early because they were worried that they would go downhill really fast. When, if they studied or compared notes with Seattle, they would have realized that simple oxygen and then possibly an antibiotic and or supplements to protect their cells from this virus, which is a thing, okay? It's a thing. You may not think it's a thing, but it is. Now, why does Anthony Fauci think it's not a thing? Why does Anthony Fauci sit there and ignore the whole thing about testing? Why does Dr. Deborah Birx, say, well, if you have an antigen test that's only like 50% accurate, then that's worse than no test at all. But I don't know of an antigen test used in Asia that's 50% accurate. It's more like 88% accurate. And they did implement contact tracing in South Korea, but they weren't playing around. And that's because they were ready. That's because they had already gone through it. Now, there really is nothing to replace experience. Experience is our greatest teacher. And I've often thought throughout my life that our society is wired to be extremely forgetful and devil-may-care sort of cavalier attitude of not preparing. Well, we had many decades of prosperity where we kind of laughed at preppers, Well, it wasn't the preppers that needed necessarily to be prepping so much, although they probably had a lot of toilet paper, but it was the government. And we see in California, the whole stockpile was sold piecemeal or given away. What it was is they had budget problems, and then there was an article in the LA Times on that. It was really shocking. I forget exactly, but they just frittered away their whole stockpile, and then New York City did the same. And then, remember, in the beginning, people were actually caught hoarding personal protective equipment. It's like the professional equivalent of toilet paper, I guess. But we were completely unprepared. And it's ironic because the CDC was not doing their one job. The CDC was busy being a globalist organization. And they would hold symposiums. They held one as late as 2018 in Atlanta. And I read that. I skimmed through their whole stupid glossy brochure. And all it was talking about was helping people in the developing world, which is fine. Great. But I mean, you're going to look like a fool if you can't help your own people and your own country. So they were talking about Rwanda and training them to do swab testing, right? And they were talking about Taiwan and how Taiwan had negative air pressure chambers and entire facilities simply built for a pandemic. Wouldn't that have been great? And then people could have gone for their treatments for heart disease and diabetes and their procedures that they needed to have for cancer. And people could have gone to the dedicated facilities, the normal hospitals, and then COVID-19 patients could have gone to the places like Taiwan had. But no, we saw ourselves as superior. Some people used the idea that we saw ourselves as superior and then we were caught flat-footed as being Trump's fault. However, Trump, like Andrew Cuomo, listens to his experts. Was Trump supposed to figure out, there's a PCR test, and it stands for polymerase chain reaction, and it requires a bunch of differently formatted machines made by different companies like Roche and Abbott and Qiagen and all this stuff. And it also requires reagents that we might have a shortage of. Let's see. No, that is Anthony Fauci's one job. That is Robert Redfield's one job. Yet this is some kind of popularity contest where Vox, which is just a joke in my opinion at this point, Vox had an article about how Fauci's testimony contradicted all of Donald Trump's lies. Well, I hate to tell you guys, but I know many people think, I've lost it, or, I'm biased. No, I'm not biased. Okay? People who are looking at Fauci like he's cool are biased. People like that need to get their heads out of their asses and do some research and start at least doing a perfunctory look into what the CDC has done. And look at how Fauci talked. How he said the risk is low, even as late as February, late February, even I think early March. No, that was early March was right. March 13th was when we were told to shelter in place and the schools closed in California at least. But he was saying the risk remains low for a very long time. Then all of a sudden, let's shelter in place. Don't go outside. And by the way, don't go outside is a terrible idea. And I don't understand why more epidemiologists and experts in epidemiology aren't saying that people's immune systems are getting weaker by staying inside. I don't understand it. What is going on here? Well, my opinion is that it's propaganda. You have half the country reading and listening to something that is just making them feel good because they're so upset about Donald Trump. They can't get past his personality. They can't get past how he triggers them. And yeah, they probably hate, they're always saying to me, well, you just like him. You like him, so, as if that's something crazy. No, I just realized what he's doing. Okay, I'm sorry, but it makes total sense. And if you're going to continue to go to media that just make you feel good, then you're not going to be getting the best information for how we as a country are going to be okay. Somebody who's screaming on Twitter that that we are selling out their grandma in favor of the stock market really, really needs to take a step back and think about their approach to reality, really, because it's not the stock market. It's people that I was referring to, like in the areas of LA, people of color who want to work. They're working anyway, okay? I'm not really sure what the police are doing because I don't want any incident, so I'm not. I mean, I'm going to work. Well, I'm working mostly from home, but I also do go in, and everybody's wearing masks. We're not stupid. I think we're capable of using proper protection. I'm taking, zinc and vitamin C and vitamin D and getting sunlight. And all those things are true. That's another thing. In 2018, there was an article about putting a special kind of UV light in public places like airports and things to kill viruses and perhaps prevent or, be a first responder to a pandemic. And then I see on the BBC, after Donald Trump talked about UV light and sunlight, BBC had some scientists saying, oh, no. You'd be killed if you were exposed to that UV light. It's like, can you not do a Google search for latest scientific studies and planned products? Can you not do that, please, BBC reporter? So I'm very sad right now because of the whole use of ventilators. I have New York City as my background because I love the city. It has a special place in my heart. My mom lived there and she worked at the UN one summer for the delegates' private photographer. And we used to go back there together. And so to think of that city suffering and, especially people of color and people in underserved areas of New York City going in there, having no one to advocate for them and being put on ventilators because no one bothered to try for compassionate use some different things. I mean, in Seattle, they used an experimental drug, quote experimental, but it had actually been around for a while, called remdesivir, which is now controversial because it's, it's really expensive if it's not being donated because it's a patented drug, whereas hydroxychloroquine is not a patented drug. Now, hydroxychloroquine was studied in how it responded to HIV and other viruses and was very, very effective. I want to tell you right now, it is not over with hydroxychloroquine. Okay. First of all, the double-blind randomized trials have not finished. Second of all, the 2 studies that came out that made huge headlines. I mean, you've got to be a freaking moron to write a story like that. Observational study did nothing and maybe did more harm than good. But right there in the article, you can see that number one, they were given the drug when they were in critical condition, which is too late. Number two, the world's probably most preeminent virologist, Didier Raoult, who has been smeared and discredited by the American media, we're such idiots. He says and has said in his very successful studies, not double blind, but neither are those. In his very successful studies, he has said that dosage is very, very important. Dosage and timing, as well as you have to take care of the opportunistic bacteria. You know when you have a cold and it's a virus, it's like rhinovirus, and then you finally break down and ask for antibiotics. I was always told that was stupid and that wasn't good, and the antibiotics were becoming the bacteria were becoming super bacteria because they kept adapting. But really, what happens is a lot of times you get a secondary infection when you have a virus, and so it makes it harder to fight off the virus. So that's why people get antibiotics when they're suffering with a virus. But there are antivirals. There's some kind of myth around saying there's no antivirals. So what is wrong with these people? I mean, I don't own a business, but I work for a small business. And it's really interesting to me how the people who are being seen as deplorables or conservatives or whatever, who are out protesting, they're the business owners. They're the producers. They are the ones that, they're very comfortable dealing with money. They're very responsible with money for the most part. And they are out there every day working hard for themselves, their families, and the employees that are counting on them. And the ones who are criticizing those people, who are saying the worst, most ugly things about anyone who is questioning the Fauci dictates, they have many times corporate jobs, software jobs, they work from home. They don't see the money coming in. They get a paycheck from somebody who's watching the money coming in. That's elitist. They are the ones who are buying this. And they're not questioning it at all. I mean, even if it was perhaps the right thing to do, which it's not, wouldn't you want to look into it a little bit? Science is not set in stone. That's why leaders, they take advice from scientists, they take counter arguments, they take different opinions, different models. Science a lot of times deals in prediction. And when it doesn't deal in prediction, science is talking about very common sense ways to deal with a pandemic. And let me tell you, I'm going to be really angry for a very, very long time about what happened in New York. And all I have to say is the media, I thought they were really failing before, the national media. They are failing even worse. And I really hope to God that everything comes out about New York and why they had so many deaths. I really hope so. I mean, there's a cop in Massachusetts that he may have already passed. I was praying for him last night, and he was on a ventilator, and they had gotten him blood plasma from someone who had COVID-19. But they put him on he presented at the hospital with shortness of breath, hypoxia, that same thing they were talking about. If he had had some kind of a defense against the virus, then his hemoglobin would have been protected because the virus attacks the hemoglobin, they think. I mean, that's the hemoglobin is the part of the red blood cell that carries the oxygen to the rest of the body. So these people are basically dying from oxygen starvation. Every time I talk about it, I feel short of breath. Anyway, the cop presented in a hospital in Massachusetts with shortness of breath. And they intubated him. He was worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And they intubated him. Well, the very first patient in Seattle, I've been talking about this since early February. The guy was hospitalized on January 21st, and they saw pneumonia in his lungs, and they gave him this experimental drug that already was an antiviral. And guess what? It didn't take a day. It didn't take 2 days. It took overnight. Overnight. He had improved. His fever went away. And they took chest x-rays, and the pneumonia was gone. They waited and monitored him until he tested negative. So, this is the same country as New York City, and yet all of these wonderfully intelligent and awesome people who run the hospitals and the doctors and the professionals, they couldn't read the literature on this first patient in the New England Journal of Medicine. I don't know. I mean, I really do think that this nation, or at least New York City, is like the equivalent of New Orleans in end of 2005, with Katrina. It's like, whose fault was it? Well, it was Ray Nagin's. Well, it was Mary Landrieu's or whatever. Well, it was this. Well, it was that. And it was the ignoring of our people of color. The warnings weren't sounded. The infrastructure wasn't there. Well, that's the same thing with this, but on a national scale, worse in New York. And it's so funny to me, people are saying it's all Donald Trump's fault, because it sounds so hollow. It sounds so obviously like propaganda, because the place where it's the worst is New York City. If it was Donald Trump's fault, the entire country, every single state would be super bad. California is not bad at all. Oh, and by the way, if you go through and look at all the states that are in warmer climates are doing better. And I still saw people on social media saying, oh, Donald Trump said by the time summer came along, this thing would be, going away. Well, that worked out really well. Yeah, it actually did in the warmer states. And by the way, we've had a very wet, cold spring. I mean, there was just a thunderstorm. A nor'easter in May. Who ever heard of a nor'easter in May? No, I haven't. And so it's been even a little bit cold here in Southern California. We haven't had a day that's over 80 degrees all year. In the Santa Monica Bay, understand, not the valley. But so you have like respected sources like Vox and BBC, and then social media amplifiers putting out things that are genuinely false. Now, seasonal viruses I read something that said they are a little bit more changeable with the weather, but they were just saying that because coronavirus is unknown, they didn't know if it would go away with the hot weather. But then, remember, nobody's going to tell you this. The Homeland Security, there was one of the officials from Homeland Security gave a presentation. This was that famous day when Donald Trump talked about disinfectant. Well, the presentation he gave said they tested this virus in the sunlight. They tested it with bleach. They tested it on different surfaces. And there was absolutely no question that the sunlight and or UV rays and disinfectant took care of it immediately. Well, we already know that. We know what viruses are. They can't stand on their own. They have to replicate. What's different about coronaviruses is they are RNA viruses that take over a cell's DNA, and they do, pretty sure they're retroviruses like HIV, and they take over the DNA of your cells. Depends on the kind of cell. HIV takes over T cells, which is an immune response. And it sounds like coronavirus takes over red blood cells, but you can figure that out if you're a scientist. Like, I really wonder about Anthony Fauci's credentials. I really, really do. You can figure that stuff out. So the reverse transcriptase virus, it's still a virus that cannot survive under certain conditions. And yet, where are these clinical trials? Okay, so you say hydroxychloroquine has too many risks. Only the risks are when it's been being taken long term, everybody. But so you say that. Where are the trials? Why aren't they done yet? Fauci has been slow walking this. Well, I was going to talk about the Flynn case, but I think I've been on a while and I had technical difficulties, but I really appreciate you watching. And Flynn case, it's awesome. I mean, if you want, you can go on the website for the House Select Subcommittee, House Select Committee for Intelligence, on Intelligence. And get this, I was wondering, why did Adam Schiff agree to release all these transcripts from the closed-door testimony? Well, he didn't necessarily. In 2018, that committee held a vote. This was before Trey Gowdy left, and they held a vote, and they agreed that they would release the transcripts. So then they submitted it to the DNI, which was run by Dan Coates, I believe, and he was an ally. And so they figured that it would be redacted. But then Richard Grinnell, who's acting DNI director, he did the redactions, and released it as scheduled. But it now is going to reveal who were the officials, the Obama administration officials, who during the transition requested the unmasking and spying on General Flynn. And so this is really, hopefully it will happen. There's always clowning around going on to try to stop the truth from coming out. And but you can go on the website of the subcommittee, Adam Schiff's committee now, and you can read every single testimony by everybody who testified in closed door session. And there's like 50 people. All the big ones: Jared Kushner, Don Jr., Hope Hicks, and then like DOJ people like Mary McCord. And then, of course, Adam Schiff had to do his little preface letter. Do you realize he wrote something like 2 days ago when the transcripts were released? He wrote something doubling, tripling down on the idea that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia. Yeah, those transcripts are accompanied by a letter from him stating that the evidence is clear, the campaign actively cultivated information brought by Russia and benefited from it, when we know that any contacts with Russia were purely incidental, that quote evidence of Trump campaign people talking about the WikiLeaks revelations, which supposedly came from Russia, that was gathered by human confidential sources who tried to go and befriend these people and give them the information that Clinton's emails were coming out. But they weren't even that receptive. I mean, sure, when they heard that they were coming out, of course you're going to use that. That's opposition research. And it wouldn't be the first time opposition research was used, such as with the Steele dossier, which was trotted out with great fanfare, leaked by James Comey and James Clapper to CNN, and then announced to the president right before he goes out in his first press conference as president-elect of the United States. They tell him that there's a dossier out there talking about how he wanted prostitutes to pee on a bed that Michelle and Barack Obama had stayed in the presidential suite in Moscow. And this stuff ended up being Russian disinformation. Yet Adam Schiff is still talking about it. So, I don't know. I mean, there's a huge battle going on. Judge Emmett Sullivan just released an order saying that he would hold a hearing of arguments from people who opposed the dropping of charges against General Flynn. And that's a whole other ball of wax, folks. If you haven't looked into it, and you're going to say, well, Flynn pled guilty twice, then I suggest you look into it a little bit, because it's really, really scary. You get caught in the federal system, they have a very high conviction rate. You get caught by the feds, you're basically screwed. And they can do whatever they want. You know what all those charges were on most of the people associated with Trump? Roger Stone was lying in his testimony to that committee. That's what he was charged with. And then he was charged with obstruction of justice. Do you see how it's done? The only way that you can see that that's a pattern is if you read about how long elements of the American government have been doing this. How long they have been eliminating their political enemies in this way. Don't believe me? Well, how could you? It hasn't been out in the news because when it comes to matters of national importance, it's a fact that many of the national media over the years, since the 1950s and before, have been cozy with the intelligence community. They're their mouthpiece, and they bring them information too. Yeah, they get groomed. Not all at all, but the CIA did admit it. They admitted it in the 70s with the church committee inquiries, and then, of course, they made sure that nobody got in trouble. After everything, they admitted a couple things, and then they made sure that the whole story didn't come out. That's actually called, it's called delayed hangout or something. Is a very strange term, but it happens a lot, and it's a classic cover-up technique. You want to know what another classic cover-up technique is? The words conspiracy theory. You see the press crowing about that. This is what they do. They put forth and promulgate people who might even be insincere, and they sound kooky. They sound nuts, and they have really far out ideas of what the government is doing. And so the CIA puts that in front. Kind of like how people said Pizzagate was like a child pedophile ring in the basement of one restaurant, rather than a whole huge research project that legitimate journalists have uncovered, legitimate award-winning journalists. So what they do is they put forward like a scarecrow version, a straw man, of quote conspiracy theories, and they use the term conspiracy theory way too much. If you see when they're crowing about that, chances are the real story is not the people that they're putting in front as kooks. The real story, thank you, Bob, hi. The real story is the one where they cry, conspiracy theory, conspiracy theory. So, Obamagate is not a conspiracy theory. When Trump tweeted on February 17th, 2017, that President Obama had spied on him in Trump Tower, he was absolutely correct. Now, would I have done that? No, but I probably wouldn't have won. I mean, everybody's been researching it since then, and it is absolutely true. It's absolutely true. The Carter Page, FISA warrant, all of that. And spying on General Flynn, it did happen. Donald Trump actually moved his transition operation to Bedminster, New Jersey Golf Club, after he heard and was warned that the outgoing team had been unmasking him, and they had been monitoring all their communications. Yeah, I know. But see, when you do research on what's happened in the last like 6 or 7 decades and more, you realize it's really not that out of, the ordinary. It really isn't. And our system has worked for a very long time, but there's so much we don't know, and there's so much tragedy that has happened that could have been avoided. One more thing, before I started looking into all this, and I was like, there's no way that conspiracies could be true because there would be too many people talking about it, right? Well, first of all, it's a need-to-know basis, right? The intel community, so you have different webs of people knowing about different things. Second of all, there are so many whistleblowers about this stuff, and they get smeared immediately. They get, painted as kooks. So if you're curious to see what a real whistleblower is like, you might want to do some research on, the CDC whistleblowers, the 9/11 whistleblowers, even just with the pollution alone. They covered up the pollution, 9/11 disease, HIV whistleblowers, where the blood supply got tainted. So, happy hunting. Thanks for watching. Keep calm and share complete facts. And please, I forgot to say in the beginning, I'm an award-winning journalist, and I have no choice but to do what I'm doing right now. And I'd appreciate your support, whether on Facebook, YouTube, Patreon, Twitter, Instagram. And, just maybe leave a like and subscribe to the YouTube channel, because all of your support really does help this message grow. And I thank you for your kind attention. And also, I have some new articles out on the website, backtofacts.com. Back to, I don't know if that's backwards or not. I'm totally disoriented with this new format, green screen. But okay, thanks a lot. Sleep well. Have a great night.